All right. Are you ready for some amazing insights from a creative, successful, and very fascinating entrepreneur? I sure am. So, today on Live with Laura, I'm thrilled to be chatting with my friend and fellow designer, Alan Smith. He's an entrepreneur who, among other things, has co created the value proposition Canvas business model generator and is the author of several books with over 3 million copies sold to date. Those are some pretty big accomplishments. Welcome, Alan.
Hey, thanks for having me, Laura.
I'm super excited to be here for a few reasons. Obviously, we're both, we actually both went to the same college and then we met up in Morocco, of all places, on a trip. So it's always great to chat with a fellow designer and Sheridan alumni. So what a small world that we meet so many years later in such a random place.
Absolutely right. And well, it shows a sense of shared adventure and shared insight that took us to the same places.
Yeah, exactly. We were just destined to meet. We were just in the wrong year from each other. So, I entitled this From Hustler to Entrepreneur. That was sort of something that you shared with me before we scheduled this. And I just thought, what a fascinating transition. This idea of hustling and being a hustler it's almost a triggering word right now for so many people. So would you talk us through the transition you went through from hustler to, an artist and designer, and now to the strategic entrepreneur that you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, my hustler phase, I don't know what it is for other people, was really the phase where I had no idea what I was doing, but I was excited about doing it. And it was like completely, essentially unprofessional, like amateur, but I was really excited. And so to me, that's like, the sense of like hustle is like, go out there and, try to do something, but with very few skills. Like I was essentially useless at the time. And most of the hustles, that I was playing with, my teens and early 20s, didn't succeed. Like, wasn't successful in that stuff. And I think the energy was right. And the skill level was all wrong. And I think today, hustle culture, right, kind of gets a little bit of a bad rap, and I understand that. I think a lot there's problems there for sure, in my view, anyway. But to speak more to the journey that you asked about, from this kind of like young, excited person who was just trying to make things happen to receiving some formal training in something and getting good at it and like finding a bit of a gift there, with design and communication, and then moving on to, product and entrepreneurship, and not just like selling services, but starting to build things, and then diving deep into that world and figuring out, basically like looking. I think the whole thing is, how far ahead are you looking? And if all you're looking ahead to is like, the next $100 and not like, the next 10 or 20 years, that puts you more in the hustler stage versus, no, you've got a plan that you've at least what's out there further along. And I think for me, my journey was really natural from struggling with trying to do currency exchange here at the border and, doing the numbers wrong, borrowing money from friends and, thinking I was going to, discover arbitrage for the first time, to, opening a design studio and running freelance before that and paying my way through school, to really starting to launch products and understand what it meant to build everything around an entire business and all of the pieces a business model needs to succeed. So I don't know what that says about my journey, but that's the high level without spending, 5 hours on it.
Well, I love that, something you just said in there was hustling is, how am I going to make the next $100? And, really having that vision of like, what am I doing for the next 20 years? Or what is that impact? That's more of that entrepreneurship. That's the range. And when you're hustling, it's really just like, what's the next immediate thing that I want or need to do? It's not about the long-term vision. So I think that's a really interesting, framing of those two kind of ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, definitely. And, for me, a lot of this stuff that I worked on was, back in more of like the hustle days and even just like the designer days were less aligned with, my values, right? And less, connected to a bigger picture of something that I was trying to create.
Yeah, and that can take time too to figure out like what does align with my values. You might take on the work because you're like, I need the work, I wanted to, need the money for whatever reason, need the experience, but it's not necessarily aligned. So it kind of takes you going through those experiences of doing the work that you don't really enjoy doing or it doesn't align with you to really figure out what kind of to reverse engineer what it is that you really do want to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you got to try a lot of different foods before you know which ones you actually like, and then seeing the effect that they have on your body takes even longer to figure out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you've been in the branding space, you've worked in design,
Mhm.
obviously you understand the world that I live in. What are some of the mistakes you've made along the way from a branding perspective, or even as an entrepreneur? Like, share some of those
Yeah,
insights with us.
I think it's nice to have a chance to reflect on this. Um, in in the early days, like as a younger designer, I was very focused on the technical aspects of design, right? Like, making sure the color palette was harmonious or choosing the right typeface and spending hours and hours and hours, choosing the right typeface, right? Um, Hours is generous. Like it was probably days on a lot of projects. And really only seeing that part of it where that is visual design, right? I think for me the
Hmm.
idea of figuring out, well, that's one part of branding, and I think I always saw branding as like visual branding or like visual identity, right? And like we had courses that taught corporate identity and things like that. I was like, oh, okay, so this is what this is. um, what I learned was there's a lot more to it than that. It's so much about positioning, it's so much about sort of like the language, it's so much about text, so much more about text than I expected and knew at the time. I think I really over-indexed on the visual side of things in the early days. A little bit later on, I think we just so a big mistake I made was also letting the fire burn for too long. So, for example, as this company I owned, we made a ton of assets that just ended up being useful, and we started to use them everywhere. We made them for one project, and then we just started to use them everywhere. Then we started to build on that, and the whole time we were like, "Yeah, this isn't really where we wanted to go," but we kept taking steps in that direction without correcting and course
Right.
correcting because we didn't have the time. And then by the time it came to fix the problem, there were so many more artifacts and so many more touch points to just physically go out and have someone address, which was a brutal pain. And then it took a year, to essentially do the turnaround on just the visual assets, side of that thing. So waiting
Right.
too long to fix a branding mistake, a visual identity mistake, I think not having, another mistake I made was waiting too long to not have a clear tone of voice guide and not have a clear sense of like, how do we want people to feel when they interact with this brand?
Right.
And as an entrepreneur, when you're doing most of the things, that's okay because you kind of know it internally. But as soon as
Hmm.
other people start taking over pieces of it, they don't know it internally. It has to be made explicit. It can't be implicit or internal, right? It needs to be made external.
Yeah.
And we waited too long. And then the same thing happened where people would be making stuff and I'd be like, oh, it's not quite right, but I don't have time to explain why because there's a million things to fix. And it would get made, and then we were just digging the hole deeper, right? Over the
Right.
years, like years and years of that type of experience. Whereas if, there's this whole saying of go slow to go fast. And if we would have slowed down and got really explicit about those things and said, okay, well, this is what we've been thinking internally all along. Let's make it explicit. Let's make it easier for everyone to use, including ourselves. So we're not, at the whims of our own personal feelings that day. I want to make something that's a little bit more like this versus I want to make something that's a little bit more like this would have really saved us a lot of time and money,
Yeah.
on that process. And I'm sure you've seen that a million times. Like everybody who comes through the door, right?
Yeah, that's essentially what Brand Camp is for. Like everything I do in that phase is all about the messaging. It's all about that voice, the tone, the personality. How does this brand show up in the world before we design anything? So design is fed from that, right? It comes out of that. But I always tell our clients, like, we'd be doing you a disservice if we only did the visual design, because our design work actually got better when I created Brand Camp and we got the clarity on the messaging. And then people know how to talk about their employees or their team members. I've had companies say, we've attracted employees because of our brand and our messaging and the way, and people know how to actually talk about our business that are inside of it because they actually have the language to do it with, as opposed to it just floating around in the founder's head in some kind of mishmashed way, which is often where it lives. They're like, well, I know it because I am it, but it doesn't mean that your team, or if somebody's doing your social media or other people are representing your brand, know how to do it without you giving them the guidance.
And in my experience, every time it got away from just being me, which is success as an entrepreneur, right? It's not just you, really having to do everything. You're starting to bring people together who can all, sort of drive towards a vision. When that vision isn't clear and isn't explicit, it's harder to make decisions, right? And it's way easier for, essentially entropy to kick in, for the room to get messier rather than cleaner. And I think it's that whole go slow to go fast thing. It works in two ways. One is it's not just go slow to go fast, it's also go fast in the right direction and, create a higher level of quality. Something that jumped out at me, was once we had put together our brand guidelines for the first time, it was so much easier to look at something and say, is this on brand or off brand, right? As opposed to like, is this good or bad? Like, is this cool or not cool? Right? It's like, well, it could be cool and it could be good and it could be off brand, meaning it's not taking us, where we want to go. And then it just made it so much easier to have discussions around what was working, what wasn't working. And for anyone to be able to make that call on their own, be empowered by saying, well, here's the guidelines, here's the, and not so much guidelines in terms of like really, really nitty gritty stuff, but even just high level, when everyone has a sense of like, we're going over here, it's easier for everybody to start moving in that direction. And, I think, I don't know if it was Jack Welch once said, is like, if you get companies that win are companies that get everybody rowing in the same direction. And I think it's true for brands, that win in creating an incredible brand. It's like everybody's moving in the same direction and creating the brand. Everybody's rowing in the same direction of trying to create the same thing and achieve the same outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say to my clients with the brand foundation they get, it's like, everything should be measured against this, like why you do what you do, your position, like all of these things, because if an opportunity comes up, you might have that shiny object, syndrome, and go, oh, that's cool. Oh, that would be really, but does it actually get you closer to your goal and the vision you have for your business, or further? It's that measuring stick. So every time I look at a decision in my business or I guide my clients, it's like, okay, this looks really cool. This sounds interesting. Does this align with what it is that I want from this? And then it helps with the decision making, because we all get tired of making decisions. We make decisions, big decisions and micro decisions all day, every day. So that actually having that guidance, that guideline, makes those decisions much easier to do and keeps people moving along the right path.
Yeah, absolutely. And, on that, I think there's we really only get to make so many good decisions every day. And so every time one of those decisions can almost be predetermined, it's a good thing. Like that just makes it way easier. I've heard we get to make about 25 good decisions a day. And this is why a lot of Silicon Valley founders taking that to the extreme and only wearing the same thing every day so that they can preserve, 4% of their decision-making power or whatever it is. Maybe that's how far you want to take this, or maybe you just want to say, no, we want to get clearer on, who we are so that we're not deciding who we are as we go. It's like, no, we know who we are and we're going to go out there that way for a while before we revisit this.
Yeah.
I
I
wanted
say
to
it's about being proactive versus being reactive.
100%. I
Yeah.
wanted to share one other mistake that sort of just popped into my
Yeah.
mind, which was looking at the way big companies did it versus working as a smaller business, right? And so, looking at Apple and Apple's website and all the things that they do right, the amount of resources they have to achieve those outcomes is crazy. Their position in the market is so much different than a brand new company's position in the market. And so like little things like I think so we tried, for example, we tried to create a conference. We did. It was a successful conference, and we gave it this great brand, and developed like its own visual identity and all that kind of stuff. And we were modeling after Salesforce because Salesforce did that, and it was like it worked for them. They have this sort of like Dreamforce event. We're like, okay, we're going to do the same thing. We took elements that like kept it like kind of the same, but there was almost all of the work that we did dumping effort into that. We could have just put straight into our brand, and none of it, like barely any of it, transferred from one into the other. And so we got kind of excited about like creating sub brands and creating all these different sub brands and sub projects because it felt cool, right? Like it was exciting to make those things. And maybe as a designer, I was drawn to like we should be making more brands because it's fun. But everybody felt that way. It wasn't just me. I wasn't even driving these decisions. I was excited about it, but I think that idea of finding focus rather than having, in our case, having too many sub brands and sub projects really hurt us because it didn't. It was all these small pieces rather than one big piece, and then cleaning that up and sort of like getting rid of all the small pieces and growing the one big piece again was wasted effort. We would have been so much further along if we would have just started and stuck with the one and been clear about it's the X for Y, event, right?
Right.
It's been a lot easier.
Yeah, spreading yourself too thin. I think that's a challenge for probably entrepreneurs and creatives like us because we get excited by creating new things. I've totally been there where you're like, ooh, then we could create this, and we could do that. And I've gone down that rabbit hole, and then you're like, wait a minute, I don't even like this, or I'm not excited by this, but I liked the idea of creating it because we're fueled by new and exciting ideas. And so
Yes.
that gets us into trouble, I think, sometimes.
It does. And it's so much easier to get into that trouble when the larger strategy isn't clear, right? It's easier to fall down that one of those like rabbit holes when you don't have guardrails, on yourself as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you shared some of the mistakes you made. What are some of the wins? Like, what are some of the things that you're like, we actually did this like really, really well? Put
Um,
pride, put like humbleness aside. Like, what was something that you're like,
yeah.
we did this amazingly well?
So I think the very first book I ever worked on, when we launched that book, we did a lot of things differently. So, we hyper invested in design. It was a really expensive book to produce, and so were all of the subsequent ones. To the point where like the amount that we spent on design is way more than any book normally makes, ever. And that was a big bet, right? Like it was probably too risky a bet to have made, at that time, but it played out. So there's some survivorship bias here. What I believe is that we did a great job of just saying, we're going to take all these concepts and make them really visual, make each one of these things very accessible, take this content, break it into the smallest pieces possible. So there's lots of entry points, and really kind of hyper focused and dissected the content to make it as consumable as possible. And that became kind of like a cornerstone of our brand because people loved it so much. People were like, this is great. Like I can flip to any page and I can feel like I can get something. And it's like, you know why that is? Partially because each page ends with one idea and a new idea starts on the next spread. They could be two related ideas, but it's only one idea per page. And we worked really hard to find that container content mix to make sure that it was, and then, there's lots of headers to jump into. There's lots of visuals to jump into on every single page. And in doing so, we also chose this like sort of like wide format. I don't have a book here, but we chose this kind of like wide format that was just differentiated. I'm a big believer in like Marty Normeyer and like brand, the Zeg thing, and his thing about like, if you differentiate, you create a new bucket in people's heads for you to compete in, where you're the same person, essentially.
Right.
And when we did that, we created this, very differentiated product that was differentiated by design, and people were like, oh, okay, I get this. Like, this is different. And then we took all of those wins and rolled those forward into the sort of like core of the brand's business, the business's brand moving forward. And having this sort of long-standing relationship between content and design that came through in the presentation was something we did really well, and I think probably one of the best. If I'm going to throw humility out the window, I think we definitely created a whole movement of copycats, and that's usually a sign that you're doing something right.
What was the name of that book?
That was Business Model Generation.
Okay.
And then we followed that up with Value Proposition Design, Testing Business Ideas, The Invincible Company, and High Impact Tools for Teams.
Awesome. So head on over to Amazon and grab a copy of those books by Alan. Actually, what was funny, when my husband and I, because you connected with him recently, and then I shared the books that you had written, he's like, we have a couple of those books on our shelves at home. So, they're around. They're around. I was like, oh my gosh, now I'm going to have to go back and read those, because I don't think I had. So it's interesting too, because for me, when I was writing my book, design was really important. So like my book is full color. I could totally, when you were talking about the expense of the book, it was like, it was nauseating for me how expensive my book was to produce, because like hardcover, full color inside, like the black sheet inside, like, I even got a special like white pen to be able to sign that page. Like, I did not make it easy for myself, but it made it really memorable. And I thought, if I'm going to be a designer writing a book on branding, it's going to be the best looking business book, right? So, and it just goes to show, like everything you were talking about, design matters, right? The typography, hierarchy, color, fonts, graphics, like it sounds so trite, like, oh, we're not saving lives, but the work we do from that respect is so important, because it allows people to understand ideas and be attracted to brands and understand concepts that would have been more difficult without design.
Well, think about it another way. How many people are actually saving lives in their day-to-day business? And so in that sense, like how many businesses are, trite? I think when we think of it from a purely aesthetic perspective, there's a limitation on the value that can add. But as soon as we start to go deeper and a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper and connect that piece, so that there's sort of like, you find that deeper kind of like core, and then the visual design is connected to it, and then the voice is connected to it, and the way that the customer service reps is connected to it. And then, the next like product line and everything about like, the product roadmap is connected to it. It's really about like wherever you come from, like if you come from that product perspective, there's cool products that could be made, but it's about getting back to that core, about what the business is about and what the brand is about. Because they're kind of one and the same, right? Like they really need to be like, I believe that the more integrated, something is, and the more honest and true it is, generally, the better it feels. Like people will just connect to those things, in my experience, better than anything else. If it's got like a truth to it, and it's not just like half a copy from here and half a copy from here, and it kind of like holds up okay, but it's like a cardboard house that when you blow on it, you're like, actually, there was nothing in here.
Right.
Like that's the feeling that you get when you interact with some stuff, and it feels like cheap and weak and like it's not amazing. I think that if you broke down the experience and looked closer at the things that you've interacted with that feel amazing, they have that kind of like hub and spoke connection to brand and business model and like core strategy and all of the other disciplines, some of which are graphic design and copywriting and different types of advertising. But that's my sense. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, for sure. It's not one thing. Like I say, your brand is so many things. It's your process. It's the journey you take people on. It's your systems, right? Like people are always surprised, but I'm like, if you don't have a proper like contract and, the way that you present what you're doing, people aren't going to necessarily take you seriously. One of my first clients, I often share the story, is that they hired me because I was so much more established than the other companies they had met. They were my first client, but I didn't make it seem like, because I had a proper portfolio, I had a pricing structure, I had a contract, I had an invoice, like I had everything sorted behind the scenes, right? That doesn't sound like that's part of your brand, but to me, that is just as important as having a great logo and color palette and website. Because if you don't have those little details, that people may not trust that you can do the work.
Yes. And, it speaks to, the sense of, I've heard one definition of brand, there's many, but it's, one that I've heard that I've found useful was brand is what people think and feel about you when you're not in the room. Mm-hmm. And so everything you do has an impact on how people think and feel about you, your business, more specifically, unless we're talking about personal branding. That I think that if we take it that way, then you're a series of contracts. The fact that, you were able to follow up at a certain, time, that contributed to your brand of, someone who felt established, right? And you could put that, essentially on, a brand board of, we want people to feel like we've always been here. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, what do we need to do to achieve that outcome? And then start to put together, the different pieces. Some of it may be in the visual design, has that kind of like older established feel. Other components of it may be things that you were doing, right? But sorry, I digress a little.
No, I think it's all of these things are important. Your process, that journey, the people understanding, what's in it for them, simplifying it so that it's not. A lot of people have these complex ideas, they don't know how to share it, and they get talking about their business, and it's sort of you lose the plot along the way, and people's eyes glaze over and they're like, I don't even know what this person's talking about anymore. Yeah. And so when you have that clarity around how to talk about it, what it is that you're offering, what it does for your clients, it makes it so much easier for you to engage people and to become memorable, because ultimately you want to build a brand that, right, people are talking about when you're not in the room.
Yeah, exactly. That has that kind of, and if you were to ask me what we did right before with our previous business, it was one where there was a lot of people talked about it when we weren't in the room in a good way. And the sort of brand footprint was so much larger than the actual like brand revenue, which creates a lot of value for business, right? I think there's some statistics on businesses that exit, they're able to earn so much more because of the brand, that they've created. Their multiple of EBITDA or whatever it is, tends to jump, where, people who are kind of like a Me Too other competitor don't have that as a value lever that they've essentially pulled and said, this makes it easier for us to do everything else. So for me, that's a big thing.
Love it. So what are you up to these days? What are you working on?
A few different things. There's a few things that are kind of like behind the scenes that I can't quite talk about yet, but I will mention. So one business that, I'm kind of supporting and helping out behind the scenes comes from, something that was personal to us, which is my wife and her health after having kids. And I think that from what I saw and seeing her have to go out there and find practitioners, people to help her get her mind, sort of, back or straight, or, rebuild her mindset. People to help her rebuild her body, to help her rebuild her strength, to help her rebuild her digestion, get rid of chronic pain. You have to work with so many people, like there's like, nutrition coaches, there's strength coaches, there's mindset coaches, career coaches. So many women have to start from zero, again, and are really kind of unsupported there. And so her dream was to take the things that she'd learned, essentially share those and say, hey, this is what I found and I want to, bring it to you. This is kind of like the 80-20, what's most important in each one of these areas. And so she's called it Matriarch, and it's Matriarch with a Q. And I think the website's launching probably at the end of the month. So yeah, Matriarch with a Q.com. And that's going to be a really beautiful health and wellness brand that I'm super excited about, and a very deep focus on brand. So it'll be, anybody who's watching this, I'm sure will enjoy it for those reasons alone, even if you're not a mom or you don't have one in your life who could use some help in those areas. And that's another friend of mine.
I can't wait to see that.
It's beautiful. I love it. And then another friend that I've been helping out is in the AI space, which is obviously we're at potentially the rising hype bubble where we may see that collapse over the next couple of years, but it's going to be a fundamentally useful technology despite the hype, right? So he's working on changing the way we do team headshots, which is really challenging in a remote environment. So essentially AI generated headshots for teams, and one place to keep all those brand assets where you're building a presentation or trying to get headshots of someone for a podcast, or trying to get the headshots of people for a website update, whatever it happens to be. There's a lot of points where that kind of comes into play, and most teams have terrible out-of-date headshots. So he's solving that problem. And the company is called saycheese.ai. I love it.
Amazing. Those were super fun. Thanks for sharing that. So before we wrap up, how can people connect with you? What's the best way for people to connect?
People could probably just send me an email direct. Just go ahead, email me at thinksmith@gmail.com. I can't say I'll respond to you right away, but I'll probably see your email and maybe I'll get back to you. And then otherwise, I'm on Twitter at thinksmith. I'm kind of starting a writing habit again. Before, all of my writing was done through the business. And so now I'm sort of going to start learning from Laura on the personal branding front a little bit. I'm excited about attending her webinar. Is it next week?
Oh yeah, next Tuesday. That's right. Next Tuesday, Why Personal Branding Matters. Join me. Alan will be there.
I'm going to be there. I'm going to be in the crowd. I'm excited to learn.
Amazing. Awesome. I will see you there. And next week, I'm going to be chatting actually with Mike Bursick from Wayfinders, which is where we met. We're going to be talking about adventure travel for entrepreneurs on Live with Laura. So hope I'll see you there as well.
I would love to follow along with that one.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Alan.
Hey, Laura, thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye, everybody.